Hi, everybody. Welcome back to my podcast, the Icarus Inspired Podcast. Today, I have a very special guest, Miron Clay-Gilmore, to introduce and discuss with you guys Africana philosophy. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the term, I'm going to read this from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Africana philosophy is the name of an emergent and still developing field of ideas and idea spaces, intellectual endeavors, discourses, discursive networks within and beyond academic philosophy that was recognized as such by national and international organizations of professional philosophers, including the American Philosophical Association, starting in the 1980s. Thus, the name does not refer to a particular philosophy, philosophical system, method, or tradition. Rather, Africana philosophy is a third-order metaphilosophical umbrella concept used to bring organizing oversight to various efforts of philosophizing. That is, activities of reflective critical thinking and articulation and aesthetic expression engaged in by persons and peoples African and of African descent who were and are indigenous residents of continental Africa and residents of the many African diasporas worldwide. Now, this is in keeping with my theme of episodes dedicated to sub-Saharan Africa politics, history, and philosophy. Obviously, this falls into the philosophy section. Now, I want to introduce my guest because Dr. Miron Clay-Gilmore is a distinguished postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for Ethics and the Schwarzman-Reisman Institute for Technology and Society at the University of Toronto. He is the first black philosopher to earn a PhD from the University of Edinburgh, also my alma mater. His research examines the racialized applications of artificial intelligence, big data, and predictive policing within broader regimes of counterinsurgency and state violence. Dr. Clay-Gilmore has published in AI and Ethics, Res Philosophica, American Philosophical Quarterly, in the Journal of African American Studies. And it is my honor now to have Dr. Clay-Gilmore on my podcast. So, Dr. Clay-Gilmore, thank you so much for being here. It's an honor.
The feeling is likewise.
So, I know we're here to talk about Africana philosophy, but I think for most people who are in like the kind of, I would say, mainstream philosophy track, or even outside of philosophy, that's going to sound like a term that they're unfamiliar with and they don't know. So could we start by you just kind of giving me like a very broad overview, and then we'll get into a lot of the specific issues, but broad overview about how the field of Africana developed, where it is now, and how long the field of philosophy called Africana philosophy has been around or in the mainstream.
Yeah, yeah. So I think as far as a disciplinary field, Africana philosophy can really has its roots in around the 1970s or 80s, and the first wave of black PhDs to matriculate and get positions in the United States. And they had some debates over methodology, but they kind of came to an agreement about Africana philosophy as a kind of what would be called a third order or like metaphilosophical umbrella type concept, which is like uh, meant to organize all these various instances of philosophizing among African and Africana people, right? And so this is broad enough to explain, historical contributions from ancient Egypt or other African antiquity or societies in antiquity, up to modern day in the Caribbean, in the United States, what have you. I think the problem with the approach and the dominant definition of it is that it's basically integrationist in an American sense. So what I mean by that is there's a there's an interpretation of the finality and the final development of Black thought to be an accomplished American democratic project, right? So this is read into figures like David Walker, um, explicit separatists, black separatists like Martin Delany, right? And so it's read all the way up through Du Bois, and so the modern tradition and in the U.S. Academy is kind of configured that way. But I think what's happening at the University of Edinburgh and the work of Tommy Curry and Norman Ajari is really a moment, that's really changing the trajectory of Black philosophy. And my work has tried to contribute to that as well by digging into the deep, deep history of kind of the basic concepts of the African diaspora, particularly since about the 16th century or so, which is Pan Africanism and Black nationalism. So what you see is our view of Black thought as a kind of autonomous historical dynamic rather than something that really has its origins in the university and the debates that's had in the university, particularly in philosophy of race. And this focus toward war, looking at population level dynamics of genocide, social engineering, things like this.
When you're talking about how um, much of the field has centered around um, integration in the past, can you talk a little bit about what that actually looks like and how the field has taken figures and kind of warped the way that their actual thought was to fit this integrationist perspective and method?
Yeah, yeah. So I think Charles Mills is a great example of this. One of the most well accomplished and known scholars in Africana philosophy. He has this really well known criticism of Western liberalism that he's really known for, famous for. But toward the end of his life, when he's given his own positive account of a social contract theory, he pulls on W.E.B. Du Bois, right? And Du Bois is a real watermark for how this types of assimilation takes place on kind of two levels. So the first is epistemological, right? So you have Du Bois, who actually is buried in Africa, credited by anti-colonial nationalists as the father of Pan-Africanism and the person who took Garveyism and made it a universal philosophy that was inherited by anti-colonial activists in the 50s. He actually integrates Du Bois with Kant, right, to get a radical liberalism, right? So it's seen as if, right, Du Bois is philosophical to the extent he can be converged with Kantian theories of, I don't know, republicanism or something like this, right? And the second level of this is what you see in, I think his last work, Black Rights, White Wrongs, a lot, which is this normative commitment to liberalism, right? It's implicit and it's unspoken, but the Black philosopher functions on the presumption, right, that it is your duty to respect the emergent liberal humanity of whites, to allow you as a Black thinker into the discipline and not pursue questions that would go against Western thought, categories, or claims to truth.
Um, if we could talk a little bit about like the delve deeper into the problems of accepting this, like just plainly this Western liberal position and what that has done for both like African philosophers and the African diaspora philosophers and African thought, and kind of explain like what the problems are with these previous approaches that just plainly accept like the dominant Western tradition, philosophical tradition.
Yeah, yeah, I think it's a problem, there's this epistemological problem I was talking to earlier, right? So what you end up actually doing is not actually studying the traditions that are said to be the object of knowledge. You're not studying them if you read their thought into Western categories a priori, right? If you have a legitimization criteria that is not philosophical, unless Du Bois can interface with Hegel, right, or Fanon can interface with Sartre, right? You actually go against the dominant trends of their thought. So I think there's an epistemological problem, but I also think there's the reification of a really of, of a really core myth at the heart of the Enlightenment, right? That what was defined as the secularized type of practice of philosophy in the 17th century and the 18th century, and crystallized in the 19th by Hegel and Kant through ethnology, is legitimate. That it's a legitimate field. That it actually constitutes mankind's search for knowledge and wisdom, right? And so, as Black thinkers, by us playing into that and reading our figures like that, we actually validate what we know historically is a white supremacist claim to knowledge.
Walk me through that last part about the white supremacist claim to knowledge and how we can really understand and unpack that.
Yeah, yeah. I always teach a book, man, in my introduction to philosophy courses by Peter K.J. Park. It's a really good book. It's called Africa, Asia, and the History of Philosophy. And what he shows is that the modern Western tradition and the origin narrative about a miracle that happened in Greece that was inherited by modern Europe, right, and then developed into the formal type of profession we know today, was explicitly the product of ethnological science. And ethnological science was the birth of anthropology, and it was actually born in the University of Edinburgh by by James Cowell Pritchard, who was actually the student of Dougal Stewart, right? The moral philosopher, the famous moral philosopher there. So you actually see early race science and pseudosciences become the basis of how we distinguish not only how Kant constructs the history of philosophy, but how Hegel distinguishes philosophical thought among whites and non-whites. He degrades them to religious thinking, right? And these basic categories inform the modern continental analytic divide in America.
So it's something like there's this myth in the philosophical tradition that essentially like the what people see as the dominance of philosophy being Western and the tradition that started with the Greeks and then went to the Germans and the Enlightenment, they see that as being almost like a race based thing where the European white race has superiority over other races because they just see that philosophical tradition as being the only legitimate tradition or the only one that is 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 the one that is most prominent. Is that something like what you're saying?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I used to ask Charles Mills about this all the time, right? I was just like, why? Look, if you show me that social contract theory is racist, why are you giving me a new social contract? Why? It just didn't make sense to me. And he says it in this book, and he would say it. What liberalism is globally hegemonic. Period.
Say
Right?
that one more
It's
time.
Yeah, yeah.
Liberalism is what?
It's globally hegemonic. Right?
Oh,
Right? White institutions and patterns of governance are globally hegemonic, right? So we should pluralize them toward the problems of race, but not destroy them, not advocate for entirely new paradigms, right? And so I think what Takeshi Murasato, another philosopher at the University of Edinburgh, what he calls the Edinburgh School of Philosophy, through the work of Curry, Ajari, and myself, I think we're trying to, bring a new birth to Black thought and Black philosophy, right? Outside of the canonical pressures toward assimilation that you see really crystallize through I think, even the most radical thinkers in the field as it exists today.
can you walk me through some of the core tenets of that new approach to Africana philosophy that you said has really been birthed around this school of thinkers, including yourself?
Yeah, I think a major core tenet is intellectual genealogy, right? So, as a philosophical method, looking at the intellectual history and culture of Black people, and deriving concepts from that. So, Norman has a really, really good article on, I think it's called A Plea for Black Intellectual Autonomy, where he goes through and problematizes this approach in the UK, France, and the United States. And he derives, one major thesis and core theme that has always stuck with me uh, is a conception of slavery going back to the writings of Baron de Vesty, who wrote the first treatise against slavery in revolutionary Haiti, right? And he says there's a conception of slavery as a pleasure-driven killing machine, right? I mean, like those are the kind of concepts I think that ground this Edinburgh School of Philosophy, right? In my view, I would call it a kind of like counterinsurgency or type of an instance of savage warfare, right? But I think looking at populations, the patterns of targeting, and the effect and relationship that the discourse of race has to the discourse of civilization in the Enlightenment, right? That's key, that type of philosophical anthropology, not what you find in analytic fields, which is, basically like debates over the scientific existence or lack thereof of racial categories. And
When you say the focus on the intellectual genealogy of Black people, um, who are the main um, thinkers and the main um, I guess places that you guys are looking to actually unearth this genealogy and bring it to the public's eye? Like, where are you guys? Where are the sources of thought that you guys are really trying to draw from and look to draw from?
yeah, I think if you read Curry closely, is Martin Delany, John Henrik Clark, Malcolm X. Um, I think if you read Ajari closely, it's Baron de Vesty, Equiano, right? It's ethnology if you read Curry really closely. But I think for me, I mean, it's really the history of the Black nationalist tradition and Black writing, right? So there's a, I think it's the first anthology of Black writing in America. I could be wrong, but it's Carter G. Woodson's The Negro Orator and His Orations. And one thing he shows in that book is that some of the earliest Black writing by free Black people um, in the 17 and 1800s was not only concerned with the abolition of slavery, but self-determination of Black people. Right? There's a really good history I cite all the time called Black Self-Determination by V.P. Franklin. Right? Like to me, this is not an ideological question. It's just an anthropological. Right? What are the cultural patterns, concepts, and debates that give substance to how Black people understand their reality? They just don't happen to be what you find in analytic philosophy, right? So, like I said, you got V.P. Franklin, Sterling Stuckey is another anthropologist whose work I really like, and Du Bois as well. I think if you read early Du Bois and some of those, I think the American Negro Academy, which he was a member of, was actually the first Black intellectual institution in North America in the late 1800s, right? And I mean, what is he writing about? And about the positivity of Black culture, about the gifts that Black people have to give to the world, about Black people being autonomous and doing for self, right? So I think these are the actual historical roots of even somebody who we would consider to be assimilationist or bourgeois Black people. Um, this is what they're concerned with.
This may be an obvious and slightly silly question, but like based on what you've said, it seems like there it's not like um, black thought is a new thing. Like it seems like it's been around for a long time, both in America and in Africa. Um, what has been the impediments to actually recognizing this thought as a discipline in its own, and um, like obviously it's racism, but like underneath that, what are the um, impediments over history to actually recognizing those things and bringing those to the light, both in an academic and mainstream sense?
Yeah, I think yeah, in one sense it's obvious, but in another sense I think it's just structural. So like think about the way the field of philosophy populates and repopulates itself. You have to go through a graduate program that's 5 to 7 years, right? And then if you're going to matriculate successfully, you're not just going to graduate, but then you're going to seek tenure track jobs, be able to dictate the terms of debate for a new generation, right? Which population gets to do that in American educational institutions, right? And then the few who make it through, I know it's kind of common, but I think it's wrong to assume that they don't share the same basic ethos or class position as their white peers, right? So that's another pressure that comes from that, right? Because with a PhD in philosophy, where do you work when you have pressure from your white department head and your white peers to do real philosophy, to make this legible, right? How does this make sense in the market? But I mean, as a student, I ran across this problem, right? So the first black professional philosopher I ever spoke to, I was a senior at the time. I had a paper that I was using for applications that was on internal colonialism theory, Walter Rodney, and Black Power. And the philosopher told me, right? He says, what's your paper on? And I tell him. He says, but that shit ain't philosophy, right? That's a quote, right? He says, now you might need to apply to Black Studies programs, right? But if you want to do real philosophy, I need to hear Heidegger. That's what he tells me, right? This is before I know that was an actual Nazi. Right? So upon learning that, it's always struck and stuck with me, like, wow, as a Black student, your senior Black faculty members will, and the leaders of your field will encourage you to study Nazis before you study Black thought, right? Because there's no currency for it, right? Like the Black bourgeoisie is kind of like proof of assimilation, right? And so they rationalize that existence a lot. And when it doesn't, when they read these historical figures like a Fanon or, like I said, a Clark or a Malcolm, and it doesn't fit with that, well, we can delegitimize though. That's not philosophy. That's his history. Oh, that's just sociology. That's not real philosophy. And when we need to draw upon it, right, we can. I think it's kind of, it's quasi parasitic, but it's also like encouraged by the disciplinary structure. Like, how do you matriculate?
That makes a lot of sense, and that's a wild thing to. I'm still thinking about the what you just said about you have to read Heidegger. That's such a wild thing to say. So we talked about why this integrationist approach is faulty, and why there's a push to go in the other direction. But I want to go more in depth into like what that other direction is for the like black population, and the Africana philosophy approach. Like, what is the other path that you and Tommy Curry and Norman Najari, and also as you're saying, Franz Fanon and W.E. Du Bois and Malcolm X, like what is the other approach that they are advocating for?
Yeah, I think particularly for Nan, which is I think he's really influential to all three of us in a deep, intellectual thread between us. I think it's what we consider to be humanity. What is the definition of the human, right? And I mean, my dissertation is dedicated to probing this question, right? And how our current definition of the human and its representation of itself actually overdetermines and imposes negative social value on others, right? And it's imposed and materializes itself through these types of technological inventions, through predictive policing, through drone technology, and drone strikes. So I think that's what's really at stake, right? I think that's the potential historically of Black diasporic thought, particularly through Frederick Douglass, right? Falsifying the Western anthropology that justifies colonial imperialism, right? Showing that these people are not inferior, right? And expanding how the species itself can think about common humanity and equality.
So when you say what is a human, um, can you elaborate a little more about like what you actually mean?
So the problem is, like, it goes back to this disciplinary origin of philosophy, right? That the Enlightenment gives birth to an idea of the human, and it subjects the human species to scientific inquiry for the first time, right? And its basic ways of doing this is the pseudoscientific category of race, right? Of distinguishing it, the human taxonomy. And I think the definition of the human and what we assume that to be in its perfected European form it's reflected through all of the modern disciplines and their assumptions and their questions, right? And so I think the real potential of Black male studies and Africana philosophy in this new epoch of the Edinburgh School of Black Thought is to go to the heart of those, right? And I think you see Fanon doing this, right? Like, and I think that's why he's a really important thread because, when you get to the end of Wretched of the Earth and past the first 50 pages about violence, he's talking about a new universal humanism, a new world order, right? But the way we think of civilization and humanity, basic concepts have to be falsified and exploded and reconfigured.
So it's something like the and correct me if I'm wrong if this is a complete oversimplification, but um, the world order that the Enlightenment and the kind of um, scientific revolution brought about was one where there was a clear like hegemon, and then like there was a you had the white Europeans who were kind of put above on this hierarchy where they were like above, and then you had like the I guess what Edward Said would say is like the Orient, and then like also like sub-Saharan Africa, which were treated as beneath the white European classes, and created this world that we're living in now, where essentially you have like the wealthy, quote unquote, developed nations in the West, and then like the poorer, quote unquote, less developed countries in the global South. And what Fanon and some of these other people are trying to do is eliminate those hierarchies and eliminate those imbalances in the world. Is that kind of correct?
Right, right. So, and like the real rub here is that those hierarchies are sustained by systems of knowledge, right? They're informed by systems of knowledge, by scientific innovations. They guide those, right? So it's not just that Europeans are projected over non-whites. They created discipline of ethnology at the University of Edinburgh. And then they study and confirm it. Then they debate the particulars of it. Then they create new concepts to justify how we're going to enslave people, how long they need to be enslaved, right? I mean, so that's what's at the core, right? How the structure of civilization itself from these basic kind of assumptions of modern Western thought.
So like you as you said, there's these structures that are rooted in like science, and then these universities, these institutions build upon those racist structures, and they create all of these sub disciplines and sub arguments and some debates, but still under that same foundation. And so the struggle is how, when you enter into that discipline and you're entered into like a philosophy degree, and then you're kind of put in this position where you're just supposed to be in these kind of these on kind of the multi-layered, or at the top of this pyramid, where the bottom structure is built upon racist foundations, but you're just kind of stuck debating issues at the top of this pyramid, and then you're not actually able to get to the root of dismantling that racist structure in that period. And it seems like that is kind of what the project that you're trying to do is actually say, well, hang on a minute, like the issues that we're debating at most philosophical universities is founded upon racist structures. And so we shouldn't just be continuing to promote this same field of thought or these same racist structures. We should actually work to create a new foundation, a new structure that is not built upon these racist and hierarchical foundations.
Right, right. I mean, I explicitly draw on Black cultural nationalism. So I actually just authored a conclusion chapter to this forthcoming anthology on Black philosophy and the Black experience. And my argument is that the task of the Black philosopher in this millennium is to gear our thought toward Black intellectual, social, and economic autonomy. Right? I think the task of the Black philosopher in the academy has been fundamentally taken away from the role of Black intellectualism over the last 200 years, right? And the use and the weaponization of ideas for the survival of Black people.
Could you just say one more time, like the idea behind Black cultural nationalism and what that
Yeah,
entails?
yeah. Black cultural nationalism, I think, has its roots around that same time, so late 1890s, where you see the first Black scholars study the history of Black people, right, and explicitly try to falsify the narratives that you see emerge from the white academy from outside, right? So they're already doing this through ethnology, like people like Delaney in the American School of Ethnology, but with their own institutions, to create institutions to do it. So you get the American Negro Academy, you get Woodson's Institute for the Historical Study of Negro Life. They create Black History Month, Negro Journal Weeks, right? And so they curate Black humanity, right, to the world. Um, and in the 1960s, I think really the explanation of Black people in the modern U.S. Academy is a result of Black cultural nationalism. So you have groups like the Black Panther Party who have autonomous educational programs, right, where they teach Black cultural history in a positive way that negates the stereotypes of the white system. And then those become the models for what students end up fighting for in these Black studies programs, right? And so Africana philosophy as a field really has a deep, deep link to this. So if you look up the Africana Stanford Encyclopedia entry on Africana philosophy, it's authored by Lucius Outlaw. Lucius Outlaw, I know through a personal mentor, was inspired by um man, he just died at Cornell. I want to say James Stewart, James Hall. But he basically founded the Africana Studies and Research Center at Cornell. Yeah, I think it's James Stewart. Um, and I mean, they got this program by taking visitors and students hostage, right? They locked the building and made a demand to the administration armed. We want an Africana Studies program, right? So this guy inspires Lucius Outlaw to fight for a conception of Africana philosophy. Like the links are just that tight, right? So that's the irony of this wave of integrationism, right? That it's Black cultural nationalism that explains the presence of Black people and their prominence in the U.S. Academy as it is.
So I'm having a little bit of like trouble drawing the link between like um, the idea of Malcolm X and the Black Panther Party and creating these schools of thought, um, and within like universities advocating for Africana and Black studies and the idea of like Black cultural nationalism. Um, is that something like Black cultural nationalism advocates like I'm
Yeah,
sorry
yeah,
to say.
building Black institutions. Yeah, building Black institutions, right? Autonomous Black institutions. I mean, this goes back to slavery, right? In like the 1830s. The the first Black political organizations are not the Democratic and the liberal Democratic or Republican parties, right? They are the Black convention movements in Cincinnati and in the Midwest, right? Where Black people debated the future of the destiny of their race and wanted to end slavery when white America said it was a permanent institution, right? So that's the dream of the Black cultural nationalists, Black institutional autonomy, right? And this is the voice of Black men. That's why you have Black newspapers, Black churches, right? Autonomous Black institutions, right?
Autonomous Black institutions within the US, because I think one of the things that I read in one of your pieces was talking about how like the um, the Black population in the United States is not seen as a colonized nation, but in reality there is like they share a lot of the same um, tenets of colonized peoples, and so like the idea of an autonomous Black institutions are to combat the colonized, which would I guess would be in this sense like the mainstream American institutions, which fundamentally exclude Black people from those institutions.
Absolutely, right. Right. And see, the thing with this is that is within the United States is because you have the history of the colony of Liberia, right? And so there was an expressed interest in the 1830s among the white population to purge educated Black people because those were the ones writing against slavery. Those were the ones spreading abolitionist ideas to the non-literate, right? Frederick Douglass writes about this himself. And this is why they opposed the American Colonization Society and removal to Liberia. Um, Even though it was a popular dream for a long time to leave, people recognized that the opportunity was given before slavery was ended because they planned to make it permanent and purge those who were willing to speak out. Right.
For those who are unfamiliar, could you just explain briefly like what happened in the 1830s in Liberia and what that was?
Right. Yeah, so Liberia is basically a colony of the United States in Africa where free Black people were deported, basically, right? They were deported, and so they were managed basically through neo-colonial measures their entire history. Their constitution is modeled on the United States. The economic affairs was monitored by the United States. Their labor was exploited, very similar to Jim Crow working populations within the United States. They were just abroad, and so the problems that came with that type of dynamic. I mean, and this is what you really see Booker T. Washington responding to, right? Of cast your buckets down where you are about the 1910s. That immigration is over, right? That the masses of people is too expensive and there's no land for us to go to. We're gonna have to build institutions here, and we're gonna have to use those institutions to survive. And I mean, this is so significant I mean, we talk about Black studies as a victory, but it was actually a compromise. The first Black wave of Black students fought for a Black university and community-centered education, not a department that I could get 125 credits in and matriculate into the system. That was a compromise.
Thinking about like this idea of building these autonomous nations in a kind of colonized environment, um, like what are some of the, because when you have like an actual colony, like what we would typically call a colony, like in Africa, and then there's the decolonial struggle to establish their own state, have their own governance, have what we saw like throughout Africa, like in Kenya and in Algeria and in Ghana and in Angola, like everywhere where there was these pushes to establish their own autonomous institutions and autonomous states. What are kind of the similarities, but also the differences with that same struggle in the United States, because it is not typically seen as a colony in the eyes of, like, I guess, mainstream people, but also that it's it's more difficult to kind of establish parallel governance or parallel like you can, like what I mean is, that's for example like the decolonial movement in Kenya, when um, when the decolonialization process was complete. Arguably you could say that it's still ongoing, because there's remnants of the bourgeois who were, you know, reaping the benefits of the colonial project, who their descendants are still in power. But regardless, when that decolonization process is over, that they then take control of their land, their country, and establish institutions that are built, that are kind of the most prominent, have the most power in the country. But what does that look like in the United States, where you have like a presidency and all of these institutions that have been built up, and from its history have been built up to exclude black people from positions of power? Like how do you combat that in a place where you don't have the same I don't know, like, I'm gonna say like control of the land, but that's not the right way to put it. But I think you understand what I'm trying to say.
No, no, I get you completely, man. I think that is a question you can find implicit in many radical Black thinkers. I think Huey P. Newton was the only one to give it theoretical significance. And what I mean by that is like his theory of empire. One of the premises is that the United States is a global empire. It controls all nations directly or indirectly. If you accept that premise, then they only provincially control territory. They don't actually control their nation, just like we don't, right? Just like we don't, right? So their goal is to build institutions the same way our goal is to build institutions that can last, right? Until the ruling class can be defeated and we can truly spread the wealth among all people, right? But I think you see this tension. I mean, even going back to Mark Delaney, I mean, he runs for governor. And I think he's the first Black political prisoner, Black nationalist political prisoner, that is. I think because he's attacked for getting state power the legal way within the system, right? And trying to assimilate after the Civil War. So, I think I look at this through a lens of counterinsurgency. I think the similarities are so similar because the basic patterns of militarism among Western armies and nations and their approach to non-Western populations, they don't change because it's internal or external, right? They are literally the same. From the police, I mean, police are explicitly configured on military forces in the 60s, right? America explicitly embraces a global control of security in the Western framework, right? So I try to give that theoretical significance, and I think they are the same for that reason. And I would, like I said, I would call it counterinsurgency. But I think it also presents some of us with the same types of objectives as well.
When you brought up the idea of the U.S. not being a traditional nation, but rather an empire that seeks to control institutions globally, can you expand upon that idea a little bit?
Yeah, so I think you see Huey P. Newton crystallizing this in his theory after World War II, right? In America's global control of technology. And you can find this even in some of the CIA manuals he cites as well, that the United States took this posture of protecting the world order. There's a really good book called U.S. Ideology and Foreign Policy. I can't remember the name of the author right now, but it's really, really good. I think it's Michael Turner. It's really, really good though. And what he shows is that, this is basically true, right? In the post 1960s, the United States took, or the post World War II period that crystallizes by the 60s, the United States takes the clear role as the premier Western power. They're going to combat the Soviet Union and communism, and there's ideological shifts that happens to accommodate this. And one of these ideological shifts that happens is a redefinition of what it means to police. And in the parlance of counterinsurgency, um, pacification, right? Global pacification campaigns. But I mean, what that looks like today is the global hegemony of the United States military and its ability to control the flow of resources around the world. And I think you see that basically actualized today in the 700 plus bases, the Navy, the size of the Navy, the size of the military, and its capacity to basically wage wars everywhere continuously without end.
I want to ask you like about some modern issues kind of in this the same idea that we were just talking about. And one of them, which is a field that I'm entering into now, and that's journalism and news. And one of the things that always strikes me about news coverage is, you'll be take it like the New York Times, the BBC or Guardian or whatever, and you'll be reading kind of the top news, and then you'll find at the back pages or the very bottom, you'll have things like 200 people killed in Nigeria, and that'll be the back page article. Or like you'll have, civil war in Ethiopia, like upwards of 500,000 people killed. And in the same breath, I know that if something like that happened in France or in Poland or in, Italy, there would be rallying cries across this country. There would be rallying cries, um, you know, in the newspapers would have it in the front pages all the time. It would be all these news stations would be talking about, and yet we see when it comes to things happening in sub-Saharan Africa, it's like given almost no attention. Is that Why do you think that is? And is that because of we're just geographically distant from those events, or is there a deeper reason that you think is the cause of why events that happen in Africa are just not seen as important in Western news.
Yeah, no, I think it's a reflection of that Enlightenment taxonomy we were talking about. In philosophical terms, I would call that division an ontological division, right? That black people in particular are an inferior kind of existence, and so their world doesn't matter. What happens to them doesn't matter, right? Like Fanon would call it a zone of non-being. They're underneath in this realm of being. Actual people are there, but you're not one of them, not fully. You know.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I guess another part of this that I'm asking about is like when you're talking about the U.S. being an empire that seeks to control institutions globally. Like number one, how are they able to control the spheres of information? Like because there's the academic institutions, but there's also like the news information that we get, and it seems like from my perspective, that the news that comes out is so Western centric and so focused on like North America and Europe, etc. But at the same time, those are the places that I'm physically in, and those are the medias that I consume. So is this a product of where our like geographical eyes are turned, where it's like we don't see things that happen in Africa and in Asia and in South America as being like kind of the center of the world, or like we don't see them as being, we see them as kind of in the periphery to us, or is it that we're just physically removed from them, so you know we don't hear about what happens as much?
Yeah, no, I think it's a little bit of the first one. Like, not only is there this view in the Western mind that non-Westerners are below them, but they're also less progressed than them through time. They're less civilized, right? So they're more primitive. So you have that type of assumption, but I think that informs something deeper. And I really took it to heart from Huey saying that. But during my dissertation research, I actually found evidence of this, that the digital revolution, or the third industrial revolution, as it's now called, that spawned computers and an information revolution and the ability to communicate information across the world through email, etc. It was actually triggered by the U.S. military, right? So the U.S. military in the 1960s, explicitly for the purposes of counterinsurgency, and under the rubric of counterinsurgency, they were doing this is to predict revolutionaries, right? So to predict revolutionaries, they created proto algorithmic software and uploaded it into the first AI laboratories at MIT and Stanford University for the Vietnam War under Kennedy, right? And then this project became a global endeavor. At the same time, it's embracing this duty to protect the Western democratic order around the world, right? So I don't think it's actually accidental that our patterns in media consumption actually reflect these basic categories that guide military logics and the creation of doctrines. Right? I think it's a part of this epoch of Western thought that I think has just been unfolding for about half a millennium.
When you talk about how to kind of combat this, particularly within the media standpoint, when you kind of in the same breath that you're talking about building autonomous black institutions, what is the the relationship between both um, African Americans and actually Africans in sub-Saharan Africa in to build these institutions. Like, is there any, um, I guess, collaboration, or is there any effort to kind of work together to combat the same forces that are opposing?
Yeah, I think you see him in the digital media space, right? So you had this one black-centered news station called Africa Stream. It was targeted by Joe Biden's State Department representatives, and actually it was targeted as being Russian propaganda and terminated from the internet and had all its accounts taken down. But I think that was one really good one. I think another one is Watch the Dome TV. You know, he has a Pan-African perspective, and I think there's a general type of paradoxical quality to this. So as we were talking about earlier, right? Like to be anti-colonial in America means that even if you could build an institution, you can never truly govern yourself, right? Whereas that if I'm in Africa, I can have a government, but it's economically deprived and not able to develop properly, right? Well, I think African Americans being inside of the United States, inside of the host settler colony, gives them access to technology sooner. And I think, particularly the predominance of hip hop music and culture is a testament to that, for better or worse. I think a lot of times it's worse, but there's a more influence that can be exerted through digital technology because we have access to it, because we live in a country that has fast internet, easy access to the internet, more computer technology. Doesn't mean we always have the wealth to acquire it, but if we can get the money to do it, there is a type of interface we can have with the international audience. I think even the protests of George Floyd showed, in the Black Lives Matter, with their discourse online, really had a global conversation that Black people were interested in everywhere.
When you said for better or for worse, can you elaborate on why you think sometimes it's for the worse?
Yeah, I mean, so under Obama in 2008, Hillary Clinton was actually quoted telling news representatives that hip hop is a chess piece in U.S. foreign policy, right? And I think a lot of times the commodification of Black culture is simply seen as a cultural issue, right? But I think our assimilation after the '60s, it was not simply a positive development for democracy. It also was a strategic foreign policy move to allow the United States to blunt the criticisms of the Soviet Union of them being a racist bourgeois republic, right? And in the absence of the Soviet Union, hip hop can spread to areas that are otherwise impenetrable by the U.S. military, like Cuba, parts of the Caribbean, parts of Africa, where there's information dominance through the popularity of African Americans who are wittingly or unwittingly spreading negative messages and consumerist types of themes to third world populations, right? Often at the behest of direct white owned media technologies and corporations. So that's what I mean for worse. Like, you can get, a great TikTok here or there, a podcast here or there, um, a YouTube show here or there. But I mean, millions of Africans know who Meek Mill. I'm not sure that's a positive thing for resisting oppression.
So you think it can be like a band-aid of sorts, where it acts to kind of um, outwardly show that they're doing something, but actually they're not fixing the problem at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is what's pernicious about counterinsurgency, right? Like, I used the term pacification earlier, but all that means is assimilation, right? The goal of an empire is to expand its boundaries and increase its population. right? It's just what type of how you're going to behave under the sovereign. That's the problem. So there's discipline, methods of discipline and surveillance that need to be input there, right? But the perniciousness and the danger of assimilation in America in the last 50 years is that it's sophisticated American imperialism, right? So we're so progressive, we can have a black president who kills Muslim men and boys with impunity under the guise of being a military age male target, right? We're really progressive. We can have a State Department worker who wears her hijab. We're not bigoted, right? But we can have dark people carry out white supremacy. I mean, this is what black radicals in the 60s called neo-colonial colonialism. This is what Kwame Nkrumah said was going to happen. There's a black face put on white systems, right? And we know now that America has mastered it.
There's so much there that I want to ask you about, but um, I'll come back to some of my questions later. But talking about how the sophistication of American imperialism, how are technologies like artificial intelligence and algorithmic ways to control social media platforms allowing the American imperialism to continue to expand and become more complex and sophisticated, making it harder to unravel.
Yeah, I think the internet is a great example. So I mentioned earlier that the internet comes out of efforts from the Pentagon for counterinsurgency in Vietnam. But I think like look at a corporation like Google, right? Like you sign away all your privacy rights. It keeps copies of everything you search on any type of platform on your computer if you have a Gmail account. And if you email someone with a Gmail account, they also have those privileges to do it to you as well. It's basically a brain tap. It's basically a brain tap. It's the biggest, largest surveillance tool ever, right? And I think you see this long range sophistication of weapons to track and kill the targets of counterinsurgency warfare, was formerly known as savage warfare, right? So you see this, like I said, at the birthplace of the Enlightenment, right? What is civilized man and what is the savage? The birth of the human sciences, right? And that distinction keeps guiding not only the introduction of modern hollow tip bullets, but the creation of rifles. Many people don't know rifles were created with African targets in mind explicitly, the introduction to explosives, not only rockets, but also aerial bombardment to modern battlefields, was justified based on this distinction between civilized and savage populations. This was something birthed in Africa, right? So the first aerial bombardment actually happens um, in Libya in a fight over colonial territories, right? And then it's eventually applied on white populations thereafter, right? But it's tested, right? Like the savage becomes a laboratory for the perfection of ways to kill and track. And so the post 9/11 period has really seen those prototype of algorithmic approaches to population control. Even drones and unmanned aerial vehicles were actually birthed in Vietnam. They've taken more prominence, become more sophisticated today. So where we have things like a Predator Reaper drone, right? That can see a picture of a person, hunt that person, and come back. Or even a kamikaze drone, or what's called a harpy drone, which has no explosive, right? It finds a target and turns into a self-immolating munition. It just charges into you, and when they find it, it'll be stuck in your body, right? I mean, these types of things were unimaginable 300 years ago, right? I mean, when you think of like war for most of human history, it's nowhere near this complex or exterminatory. The ability to track targets, um, map their movements. There's new cyber weapons. Like I don't know if you heard of Pegasus. No? Oh my God, nigga. So So they have this cyber weapon. It started off as a call, right? So it would call your phone. It was only able to be done on phones outside the U.S. And so it's created by Israel, this Israeli group called the NSO group. They're basically their demography is basically former intelligence personnel from the Israeli army who already know how to code and are good at math. It calls your phone and it installs itself whether you answer or not. It was updated to send a text message, like a just random text message. It's live surveillance of what you're doing on your phone and where you are anytime it's powered on, right? I mean, the abuse from this tool has got so bad that in Mexico City, which is one of the premier places it was leased and sold to, journalists, academics, lawyers, anyone who dissents was coming up missing for about a decade period, right? Until these journalists found out all of these people had their phone tracked by something that was leased by the government. And it's not exclusive there, right? It's been found in Morocco, it's been found in Australia. I mean, it's been found all over the world. And these are prominent people. I think the president of France had his personal phone tied to a number that was found on these target hit lists, right? So I mean, just the nature of surveillance has taken on a global scale that I think is just unprecedented.
You mentioned that the internet was developed by the I don't remember if it was the State Department or the military, but basically the same thing at this point. Do you believe that, or do you know that AI too was also developed for like a surveillance warfare use?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. These all came out of the same effort for counterinsurgency. I published on this, but there's a really good book on this called Surveillance Valley by Yasha Levine. He talks about, there's another one, I can't remember the author, but it's called Racketeers of War or something. Oh man, I can't remember it properly. But it's more than one book on this. This is known in military history. It's the first AI laboratories were funded by the Pentagon actually, and it was for the purpose of monitoring and predicting social revolt. And just to keep in mind, the administrators did not put a qualification on the applicability of this. Okay, so they took data from third world countries, the Black Power movement, Martin Luther King, domestic and international trends. Their goal was to predict revolt. And so, I mean, I think it's a lot of what we see today are just logical consequences of what it was actually created to do.
How much of the the intent to control and survey and defeat any kind of counterinsurgency movements or any kind of real movements that would pose any threat to the status quo, how much of that do you think is institutionalized so that people who are contributing to those things don't even know that that's what they're doing? Or is this something that each person, like in the State Department or in the administration, knows that is the stated goal of their actions?
I don't think so. I don't think they all know personally or hold certain beliefs, but I do think that this is a deeper structural type of thing, right? We're talking about the basic structure of American democracy, right? The basic structure of modern civilization. There is no new world without counterinsurgency, right? Without non-Westerners assuming they're more civilized and uplifting the non-civilized through force, which brings military application first and then institutions of governance thereafter, right? So I think this is just a structural type of thing when it comes to the nature of Western civilization toward non-Western.
Okay, I wanted to come back to something you mentioned earlier regarding like the civil rights movement in the '60s and um, kind of how the U.S. at the time saw that as a foreign policy strategy to eliminate accusations from the Soviet Union that they were being racist. Um, First, I guess my question is, how do you see the result of the civil rights movement in the '60s? Like, did I know? Obviously, there was progress in the sense that the Civil Rights Act was passed, and um, things like segregation were outlawed. But in terms of tangible progress to dismantle this uh, racist systems and the structures upon which the U.S. was being built, how much did it actually achieve in that regard?
Yeah, I think it obviously has certain benefits as far as integrating public institutions. Um, but I think as far as the claims of progress that and the narratives of progress that often guide philosophy and other fields of inquiry, it definitely has not lived up to what the claims are. Right? I mean, look at sociological metrics. Look at um, life expectancy, wealth, patterns of incarceration. There's a recent study that showed that even black men born to millionaire families have a higher rate of incarceration or equivalent rate of incarceration with poor white Americans, right? But white men born to families that make 35,000, 40,000 go to jail the same way as millionaire black men, right? There was another one, an economic study that showed over time that black men, not women, born to the upper class were more likely to be disadvantaged over time and have lower their social mobility, end up in the lower class than stay at the class they're at. Right. So there's problems of social mobility that seem unique to black men, and there's been studies that tie this marginality of black men economically to the outcomes for the entire race because they end up being heads of families, right? So even when black women make more money, if they marry a black man who is economically marginalized, the economic output of the household is inhibited, right? White men don't have that dynamic. And so the white women end up, when they pair bond, ended up economically different. So I think you still see a deep, deep stratification of the races, right? Even pattern neighborhoods, residential segregation are essentially the same, you know?
Um, you know, growing up and in the school system, one of the main things you hear about um, in this the civil rights movement is, you know, MLK is kind of the central figure that you hear about, and you don't really hear much about Malcolm X or um, you know, any of the main figures, and you hear about MLK in the version of um, he he advocated just for like peaceful coexistence, and then you don't really hear much about why he was murdered, why he was killed, and I think there was this idea that I was hearing from somebody recently where essentially like the US government was okay with quote unquote like propping up um, Martin Luther King when he was advocating for like just peaceful coexistence and kind of um, distorting his message and what he was saying. And then as soon as he became started to speak up and become a little bit more radical and his message wasn't able to be controlled, the government saw him as this threat because they realized that what he was trying to change was something more structural, and actually trying to dismantle this the idea of the U.S. empire and the hegemonic control to oppress non uh, non-white European people. So I guess my question is twofold. One, do you believe that the U.S. tries to prop up certain figures and distort their messages to kind of prevent the more underlying criticisms and the more underlying, I guess, critiques from coming through to the mainstream? And two, do you think that there's a effort within the U.S. public school education system where the way that history is being taught to American students is such that it it perpetuates the same hegemonic control that we've been talking about?
Yeah, no, I think the narrative, I think it's like historically false, but I think it's getting at something important that many people don't realize. And that's the fact that the United States government was invested in ending Jim Crow. Okay? Jim Crow, yes. Right. This is a strategic thing. There's a really good historian. He got a book called Racial Matters, Kenneth O'Reilly. He has a whole chapter on this, right? The FBI's goal was twofold to kill Jim Crow and the civil rights movement, right? So they are invested in assimilation on certain terms, right? Remember, this is the goal of empire. They are assimilated or interested in assimilation, right? But it has to be on their terms. Martin Luther King, from the evidence I've seen, has always been outside the boundaries of what the FBI considered to be a good Christian, particularly Hoover himself in his version of Christianity. Excuse me. So I think King is interesting and becomes this kind of foil in this narrative because of how the US actually assimilates Black people. And what they do is that they realize that the foot soldiers of civil rights and Black power are Black students, college students. And so they buy off the college students. They offer them jobs in corporate America. They offer them master's degree programs, government jobs, particularly in education, criminal justice, jobs that were under Jim Crow formerly reserved for whites only, right? And they become the middlemen administrators of the Black underclass, right? And I think within the narrative of them rationalizing this, Martin Luther King becomes the emphasis, right? In their retelling of Black history and civil rights, right? Because that picture of him jives well with them getting a six-figure job and working for white people, right? And so he becomes a victim of history. But I think you mentioned something important, right? Is that, I mean, there's a really good book called Nixon's War at Home by Dan Chard. He talks about this. Like, Martin Luther King was always seen as a problem, but he also was seen as going more toward Black nationalism. And so the preemptive logic of counterinsurgency was such that the FBI seen it as their duty to stamp that out ahead of time, right? So he was preemptively targeted in that way because in their mind, he's becoming more nationalist oriented. And in his last book, he is more nationalist. He argues explicitly against cultural assimilation. You know, he says the goal is not to be white or give up Black values. I mean, he sounds like an early Du Bois. He sounds very cultural national.
How how did the FBI or what were some of their tactics early on, if you know, like to root out that nationalism.
Yeah, I mean, it was really like organizational sabotage, right? And so I think this needs to be said too. The FBI itself has a special relationship with Black people. Um, there's a book called FBI's, EYES. Um, I cite it all the time. Really, really good book. What this guy he's able to show is that the largest archive of Black writing in America is the FBI archives, because the FBI started off as something called the General Division of Intelligence, and Hoover was the head officer in charge of it. And this is the 1920s, at the height of the Garvey movement. And so he ends up cataloging all the Black poets and writers and artists and political speech makers and orators, and trying to keep his thumb on Black people because he sees them as anti-American in a fundamental way, right? And he uses the language of ethnology to justify this, right? In the city committee hearings, he says they lack manhood and thus patriotism. That's an ethnological category, right? The white race has it. Non-white races don't have it. And that's why their social institutions are weak and inert, right? So they need to be surveilled and watched, right? So when the FBI is officially created in the 30s, right, this is a deep kind of pattern that's just going along with it. He never stops collecting Black writing. But I think the 60s, you see this different type of push from the executive branch as a whole to manage what turns into Black riots, right? These internal Black riots and the leaders of those. And what's unique is that in order to kill Jim Crow, the FBI doesn't just target Black people and Black nationalists. They target the KKK. They target Socialist Workers Party. They target the American Communist Party. Um, but here's what's unique, right? When they target Black people, Black groups are the only ones whose leaders and members of organizations are encouraged to kill one another. Okay? So from Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, up to the Panthers, right? FBI operations are centered around discrediting bad information, something called black bagging or snitch jacketing, right? But convincing members of the group, of a violent group, to redirect that violence toward themselves explicitly.
Sorry to interrupt, but just
Yeah.
to clarify, you're saying that the FBI actually encouraged during the civil rights movement encouraged black groups to kill one another.
Yes. Right. Uniquely. They did not do that to the KKK. They did not do that to the American Communist Party. They did not do that to the American Socialist Party, right? The Socialist Workers Party, I mean, right? They did, like Fred Hampton, a lot of people talk about him, but he was killed by the Chicago PD and the FBI because they were unsuccessful in getting a Black gang member to do it, right? They were trying to get him to get killed through false information so Black men can kill each other and we can say, look, they're primitive. The state doesn't have to do it, right? I mean, there's a lot of evidence that this is what happened to Malcolm X, right? That people within his organization were goaded into killing him. So it gives the FBI a distance, right? And the author of FBI's, he talks about this, right? That they really perfected the art of sabotage on Black people during this COINTELPRO program in a unique way that they don't even aspire to among a group like the KKK.
You mentioned the COINTEL program. Could you just explain what that program was and what its purpose was for those who are unfamiliar with it?
Right, right. So it has its birth in this Cold War period where the United States is looking to combat the influence of the American Communist Party and communist ideology. And so it actually starts with the American Communist Party, right? Evidence suggests that the American Communist Party was basically in shambles at the time. And so Hoover had to play up the threat of communism in order to justify the funds. It was a bureaucratic maneuver. And so he ends up spreading this through his persuasiveness to the Socialist Workers Party and then to the KKK and the Black Panther Party. and Black militant groups more generally, right, because of the influence of communism. So that's the official justification. But I think in practice, in Racial Matters, that book talks about this too. Black revolutionaries become the real archetype of the enemy, right? They get crystallized. I mean, and COINTELPRO against Black people was very computerized, which I think speaks to the use of algorithmic predictive types of measures of police in the day. The same measures that are instituted under COINTELPRO happen at a time when President Johnson inaugurates the first national crime database, the first digital crime database, right? And then they create this database within the FBI called a rabble rouser index. But it was basically loaded with data. It was an algorithmic type of machine that kept a bunch of dossiers on Black revolutionaries, photographs, pictures, relevant variables, where they live, key relationships, right? So you see this type of like search for perfection to root out the leaders, right? And like I said, these deep roots go back to Garvey, right? Because when you read Hoover, he says the goal of COINTELPRO is to stop the rise of a Black Messiah, right? And a lot of people look at that and give it these type of theological qualities without knowing the history of the Garvey movement, and that Garvey was often referred to as Garvey Moses Messiah, right? And that the first target of Hoover as a GID official was Garvey himself, right? So he's drawing on long types of tropes of Black men as sexually having like a lack of sexual morality, threatening, uh, threats to civilization, threats to white America, right? And that criminal apparatus, I think, it really informs how Black people are still governed today through criminal justice.
Um, Once again, I have a lot of questions. I want to go back to something that you said earlier, where you said that the FBI both wanted to kill Jim Crow because it was strategically advantageous, but also because assimilation was also advantageous. Can you just walk me through why it was advantageous for the FBI at the time?
Why was it advantageous to kill Jim Crow? Yeah, it was advantageous to kill Jim Crow because of the. You got to remember the time, right? So if we're born past that age, if you're not born in the '80s, you don't remember this time. You was born into a world where America was just the dominant power, but it wasn't always like that, right? And so in the '50s in particular, remember, COINTELPRO was born in 1956, so it's right in the middle of this. The African and Indian colonies are decolonizing. And when they're entering into the world and the international community, they have to choose between capitalism or communism. And the Soviet Union, after the Chinese Revolution in 1949, has created this model that all the anti colonial revolutionaries look at it through China. They supported this. And they said, look at the benefits of China. You too can decolonize, right? And Mao Zedong is exporting revolution as his foreign policy, right? This is the world they're in, right? So they need to get rid of Jim Crow because it's proof that democracy is racist and that the socialist brotherhood of man can march the dialectical moments of history forward. That's proving their point. We need to show that democracy can rise above ethnic nationalism and sectarianism, right? But we don't need young Black men on the streets who are willing to destroy property and potentially go to war with police officers if the society is not treated and governed in an equitable way. That can't happen, right? So Black people get integration, they get the Voting Rights Act, they get housing and urban development, right? But they leave this out. And Elizabeth Hinton, a historian, talks a lot about this. The same year, they get the Law Enforcement Assistance Act, the creation of the first national police force, right? And they get the legislation that lays the basis over the next two administrations for mass incarceration, because we have to deal with the insurgent population among them and integrate those who will follow the rules and followed the dictates of American integration.
I see. So it was to kind of pull pull back another layer of the veil, where they showed outwardly that they were improving, but underneath they were just able to hide the the racist structures under under another veil of progress, I guess.
I mean, yeah, I mean, look, they didn't change the economy, right? I mean, look, we're never going to live in a world where every person has a job and there's nobody unemployed. That's the nature of the capitalist system. When those people are unemployed, they need to go on welfare and public services and then try again. They need to be disciplined into Western forms of labor extraction, not rioting. Don't we can't allow it, right? I mean, this they say this in the Carter Commission. Who's rioting? They study who's rioting. It's young black men who are unemployed, 18 to 25, in response to police violence. What do you do with that population?
Right. What are some of the tactics that the government is continuing to use now? Because I think, like, this idea of masking the real problems continues today. Like, what are some of the ways that the government has evolved and sophisticated their control methods even more in the present day, and what can be done to try to dismantle this, apart from what you were saying earlier about building black autonomous institutions?
Yeah, I think the Atlanta PD is a good example, right? So there was a recent proposal a couple of years ago by the Atlanta Police Foundation to wire up the city with like 1,000 cameras, right? Live stream AI enabled cameras that would allow them to see when a person on parole was behaving the wrong way. Right now, the people who are these people on parole? They're triple time offenders, some of them three-time felons. It's a pool of about 1,000 people. When you look at the pool, uh, about out of 1,000, 830 or so are black males themselves, right? So basically, what the Atlanta Police Foundation was to do is turn the entire city into an open air prison to watch 1,000 black men who may do something wrong, right? Like just the scalability of that type of surveillance, I think, is what's new. You see it in Detroit with Project Greenlight and the facial recognition cameras. There's actually a case in my hometown in April of this year where a man was falsely identified by an AI camera. And it took him 17 months to get out of jail and prove his innocence. So I think, that's the kind of like evolution. Oh, St. Louis. Yeah, yeah. So, but the second part of your question, and I'm really drawing Huey P. Newton for this, man. But I think the overwhelming military capacity of the U.S. state, and especially under the Trump regime, where the killing of black people seems almost as an honorific or some type of cleansing process of the society. I'm not sure that I'm not saying things can't change, but I'm not sure we have the right expectations of what that means. Right. I think we think revolt means Black Lives Matter and that you protest and then the presidential candidates can talk to you and then you become a millionaire. And I don't think that's real. Right. I don't think that's real. I think what happened in Ferguson in 2014 after the killing of Mike Brown to a lot of working class black people in my hometown in St. Louis. I think that's the reality. People come up dead. Some people are still in prison for destroying property and setting fires. Right? People were shot. People were put under martial law. That's what revolution comes with. And we're just going to have to accept that as a reality if we want to really exercise any type of agency in changing things outside of institution building. That's just my view personally.
Is is that a position that is? I know you said that's your position, but is that one that is shared by most Africana philosophers?
I think some of these major figures that informed this epoch of Africana thought in Edinburgh, absolutely, from Frantz Fanon to George Jackson to Huey P. Newton, I think you see, like, going back to Frantz Fanon in the zone of non-being. Fanon's dialectics is a system where he says, look, the only way to bring yourself into being in equality with white populations is to impose yourself through violence on them in the same way. Only after that can there be equal complementarity and real type, some type of humanism, right? But he says that that's not guaranteed to happen. You could try to impose yourself on them and they wipe you out of existence. It's just a reality, you know.
Um, Dr. Clay-Gilmore, I know we've touched on a lot of issues, and I know there's probably so much that we haven't touched on, but I really appreciate your time and insight. I just want to give you the opportunity to talk about like what projects you're working on right now and what you have upcoming to share, and I'll put any links or anything to your work in the bio.
Oh, I appreciate it, man, and I really enjoyed the conversation. As far as things I'm working on now, I'm waiting on the responses from my book, so I'll be working on my book. I got a few articles that I'll be presenting for the first time in the next few months. I got another one on technology, AI, and counterinsurgency. It should be out in the next month or so. Yeah, so this article, the most recent one that's coming out, is called Paradoxes of Being. It'll be out really soon. My book manuscript is called Thinking for the Bound and Dead. So that's under review right now at Temple University Press. And yeah, I'm about to present another paper on the history of the idea of Black self-defense through Robert Williams up to Huey P. Newton. So that's kind of what I'm working on now, in addition to looking at some of this stuff on algorithmic bias.
Awesome, awesome. Well, I'll be sure to put links to your website and all that stuff in the bio for those that want to check it out. Highly recommend. But man, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. It was fascinating, and yeah, I really learned a lot, both from the readings you sent me and from this conversation, and I hope the audience does too.
Thanks again, man. Appreciate it.